There we go. I am thrilled today to have Jennifer Finlayson Fife here as our keynote speaker. I actually encountered your work in about 2014 because I read a wonderful interview with you in Dialogue. And it was an interview called Developing Integrity in an Uncertain World. And in this interview, you talked about the difference between integrity and obedience. And I remember that being so illuminating for me. And it helped me understand myself a little bit because I had never been interested in obedience. Like obedience had never been compelling to me, but integrity I could get behind. And so that just gave me a framework that I found so helpful. So that is my first association with you, Jennifer. Later, of course, I found her podcast, and I have been a listener ever since. Dr. Jennifer Finlayson Fife is an LDS relationship and sexuality coach with a PhD in counseling psychology. She is the author of That We Might Have Joy, Desire, Divinity, and Intimate Love, the creator of several online courses on relationships and intimacy, and the host of the widely loved podcast Room for Two. Through her writing, teaching, and clinical work, she has helped many people to think more honestly and courageously about desire, integrity, intimacy, and faith. Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson Fife. And by the way, she has books for sale, so come and talk to her afterwards if you want to buy a book. And welcome.
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I feel quiet. I don't think this is on, is it? Let's see.
You're going to use that.
Oh, I am.
Yeah, you're double.
This is for the
that's
recording. Got it. Yes. Okay, good. All right. See. Okay. So, something that I've learned in my work as a therapist is how foundational agency is, this meaning agency, the ability to make choices and to self-determine, how foundational that is to our development, and in particular to our spiritual and our moral development. We claim a theology as Latter-day Saints built on the idea of agency and its necessity to our spirituality, right? We fought a war in heaven for our agency, right? And yet, I think we have a lot of ambivalence in the way we speak religiously about agency and its role in spirituality and goodness, meaning we are way more into obedience than we are into agency. Okay, yes, agency as long as you obey with that agency, okay? So I think that a lot of my clients, a lot of us who grew up as Latter-day Saints, grew up learning that obedience, trusting compliance, is synonymous with virtue. That it's a function of devotion. It's a function of faith or trust in God to do as you're told, to trust in that. And to kind of forsake your agency, in a sense, to that spiritual endeavor of obedience. Now, I would argue, actually, that obedience is, in a sense, the first law of heaven, but first as in primary, not the highest law in heaven. And it's important as an initial focus of moral development. If you look at our moral development, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. This is where we start, is in a frame of do and do not, right? Good and bad, black and white. Because when we are very young, it's the only frame we have. Okay, don't walk into the street, hold my hand, right? Don't hit your brother. They're very behavioral, very basic, and learning to comply and regulate ourselves around sort of the basic framing of good and bad is the place we start. And it's very, very important, even just for learning self-inhibition, which is one of the first things we learn as embodied beings, as young children. So while it is arguably the first law of heaven, our agency, our ability to be actors in the world is essential to our spiritual growth. And that is, it's essential in a complex, fallen world to be self-determining, to make decisions within complexity, and to take the risk of doing it, to learn how to do it. So not only is that essential to our spiritual growth, I would argue, it's also absolutely fundamental to our tolerance and capacity for intimacy and for a kind of trust in ourselves. Now, I don't mean trust in ourselves in a narcissistic way, but trust in our ability to discern and to choose in a world in which there are seldom easy answers. And so it's essential not just to our spiritual development, it's essential to intimacy, to self-trust, and also to our capacity for joy. So my dissertation research, at lunch we were talking about dissertations, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my dissertation research because I was looking at the question of LDS women's sexual agency. And the reason I was interested in this topic was because I had, well, there was a lot of things that brought me to it, but I was reading a lot of feminists. I'd studied women's studies at BYU and psychology. I was seeing clients now that I was in training, and I was working with some LDS women who'd come to see me who were really in a struggle around sexuality. Married women who were in struggle and single women. And I was also reading a lot of feminist literature and thinking a lot about women's relationship to sexuality, the sexual revolution, and all these things. And I really wanted to understand what was LDS women's experience of their sexuality. The radical feminist literature, meaning radical being root, the kind of root cause of women's struggle, is, according to radical feminism, is patriarchy. It's the oppressive institutions, gender role ideology that basically limits women's relationship to themselves by constraining an idea of who women ought to be, in the radical feminist view, for the benefit of men, for the benefit of the patriarchy. Okay, so that's the radical feminist view. Knowing that the church is a patriarchy, even though it's a benevolent patriarchy, but it is male-led. At the time, things keep changing, so it gets a little bit harder to kind of identify. But when I was writing this dissertation in 2000, the idea that that women were led by men in the home and in the marriage was explicit. We weren't apologetic for it. Now we're a little more waffly about it. Okay, so. But that women were explicitly learning, especially when I was growing up, that men are the leaders of the home, that the man is between the woman and God, and women also were learning things like, your sexuality is something, your purity is the gift you give to your future husband, that your sexuality is there to sustain and to bless him and to help him with his sexual needs. Okay, so I wondered, what is Mormon women's experience of their sexual agency? Do they feel that they are able to self-define around their sexuality? What is their experience of themselves as sexual beings prior to marriage? And what is their experience within marriage? And so I interviewed, this was a qualitative study because there really was nothing in the literature yet, but on looking at active women who'd grown up in the church, who were currently active and currently married. And I interviewed them about their premarital experiences and then their experiences around sexuality in marriage. And these were long form interviews. So there were large differences between the research participants in their sense of personal agency. That is, their ability to self-determine around their sexuality, but what I saw is high correlation between sexual agency and just personal agency in general. So my focus was their sexual agency, but you could quickly see that women who had high agency not only took their sexual desires seriously, they took their desires seriously in general. Okay, so there were large differences in the group, and the majority, now this wasn't a quantitative study, so I can't say how this necessarily relates to the church population as a whole statistically, but the majority of the women I interviewed had very low levels of agency around their sexuality and their desires. And then there was a smaller segment of women who, despite growing up in the same ideology and the same ideas, had high levels of agency. that they interpreted these and related to these ideas in a much stronger way. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about these two groups, but the women who had, I should say, the level of sexual agency women had was highly related to their self-acceptance, highly related to their self-confidence, also how intimate their relationships were, both psychologically and sexually. So when women were able to self-determine, it was expressing a kind of comfort with who they were, with their sexual nature, with their desires. And then there were women who were much more focused on pleasing or being what they thought was expected of them. And they had much lower self-confidence, much less interest in being known sexually and otherwise, and much more preoccupation with how they measured up, basically, to their spouse or to others. So, okay, so these women with low agency, I would say that basically they live very much in an obedience mindset. And so in considering the morality of their choices, they were really focused on, did I live the law of chastity adequately? I did this thing that I feel ashamed of even now, 20 years later. And so the question of whether or not they were good or virtuous or desirable was being measured often by how perfectly they'd obeyed the law of chastity, for example, as a single person. One woman that I interviewed had masturbated as a single person, as an adolescent, but she'd still never told her husband this because she feared that this would really devalue how he saw her. And so, we were doing the interview and she'd just been talking along. And then when I asked her the question of like, when did you first realize your body was capable of sexual pleasure? And she's like, she started whispering. And so I'm like, and she's like, because I'm afraid my husband's going to hear me in the other room. So I was like, oh, you've never told him? And she's like, gosh, no. And she's like, I know God's forgiven me, but I don't know if he would forgive me. Okay, now that's fair. I'm sure that he'd be like, I don't know, maybe he wouldn't have found it so aversive. Okay, but she thought that would definitely devalue her in his eyes. So I said, well, do you assume that your husband's never masturbated? And she was like, oh no, I imagine he probably has, but it's different, right? It's different for me as a woman, right? Because of so much being taught about the idea of your value is very connected to your virtue. So let's see, some women, there's so many stories, but basically as married women, they were also often grappling with questions of their value based on how well they fit the ideals of a good wife. Were they sufficiently interested in sex to be a good wife? Right, so a lot of those low agency women felt a lot of guilt and shame and inadequacy because they didn't feel enough sexual desire and felt like they were a disappointment to their spouse. And some women feared they were actually too sexual or too interested in sex. One woman really liked sex, but she feared what it meant about her. And she'd once brought home a Cosmopolitan magazine and her husband told her to get rid of that smut. And so, she hid her sexual interest from him because she was afraid that it minimized her value in his eyes. So, so the majority of the women I interviewed were focused on fulfilling what they perceived was expected of them as a good Latter-day Saint and living up to cultural expectations of womanhood, of their roles, right? For example, being a full-time mother because that's what they'd been told to be, and they trusted that that was the right path. Or, some talked about denying their desires as a way to be virtuous, to be selfless. And so these lower agency women largely viewed their sexuality as something that they offered to a man and saw sexual purity as essential to being desirable. And they generally saw their desires as being less important than their husband's desires or even their boyfriend's desires, right? So you can see how some of these women really got into situations in which they were very vulnerable to sexual coercion when they were dating because they were very attuned to what they thought God expected of them, which was virtue, what their boyfriend wanted, which was often more sexual behavior, right? And so they were in this struggle. They're all externally referenced. I should be, virtuous. I shouldn't do this because I've been told God wants me not to, and my future husband wants me not to, but this guy that I don't want to displease does want me to. And so that often in that conflict, they couldn't sort of sort out what they wanted, who they desired to be, because their moral reference was very external, not internal. And that's a real setup for adolescent girls. Like, one of the best ways to protect adolescent girls is you never let the judgment of the guy you're interested in be more important than your own judgment. Right? You never, if he has more ability to define your value, she's vulnerable to his coercion, right? Okay, so in short, their sense of self was largely external. Their morality was largely outside of themselves. Their self-perception was external, right? They were looking to the group to tell them who to be, who God is, and they largely understood this external reference as right, as the right way to be, right? That they were being obedient, that they were not being self-focused or selfish, that they could sort of demur and kind of hope that that would offer them a sense of belonging and a sense of mattering to a husband, to their LDS community, to others. So, not surprisingly, they had limited self-trust, limited self-confidence. They often trusted others' judgment over their own. And also, perhaps unsurprisingly, they were less able to accept themselves as flawed human beings and as sexual beings, right? Just as part of our humanity. So they were much more anxious about letting a spouse truly know them, emotionally or sexually, and they remained highly dependent on authority to tell them who to be. Okay, so that's the lower agency group of women, and I've kind of lumped them all into one category because there was some complexity in that group. But then a smaller but important group of the participants were much more agentic in their decisions, right? And that is to say that higher agency women, they cared about the standards of the church. They cared what the prophets said, for example, right? Again, these were active Latter-day Saints. The rules mattered to them, but they demonstrated a lot of individuality in their relationship to these rules. They self-determined, they individualized, they trusted their own ability to sort out what was right for them in the face of competing desires or complex choices. So I'll just throw this in too. Interestingly, too, they valued their desires much more. They took their desires seriously. They tended to marry men who also took their desires seriously. They saw their sexuality as being on par with men's sexuality. When they were dating men, they were actually much more able to stand up for what they wanted, including, this one woman that I'll tell you about. She was very conservative when she was dating, not because she thought sex was a problematic thing. In fact, she very much looked forward to being sexual. But she wanted to preserve it for marriage. And so she would date guys and they would try to kiss her and things like that. And she'd be like, I'm not interested. And he's like, come on, I bought you dinner. Can't I have a kiss? Okay. She was telling this one story. And she was not concerned about managing these men's feelings. Like she took her desires seriously. And so, unlike many of the participants, she'd say, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't want to kiss. And she would take her own limits seriously. So one story in particular is a woman who she cared very much about living true to the church and to the standards of the church. She wanted to be a good mother, and she also very much wanted to study medicine. And she made choices at every step of the way. She started in pre-med, and then she got married somewhere in there, but she decided, with her husband, they were in conversation about it, to go ahead and enter med school. And she said, we would fast and pray together, and every time it just felt clear that I should keep going. At this point, her husband and she both worked and both took care of the kids. They were living in a very collaborative and unconventional marriage. But she had really strikingly no apology or anxiety, even though she did not think of herself as like bucking the system or doing something, you know, to make a point about women. She didn't think of herself as a feminist. She was just like, no, I just, between me and God, and, you know, we feel good about this. And she just was kind of self-determining all along. I asked I don't know if it was a question I asked or something she said, but somehow she said, no, my husband, oh, he's definitely the leader of the home. Yeah, you know, like, you know, we're not like some crazy feminists or something. Okay, she was like, he's the leader of the home. So I'm like, what does that mean exactly? Because basically what it came down to is he's the one who called on, who said the prayer, you know, when it was time to read scriptures or whatever. But like, they were actually both making money. They were both helping with the kids. I'm not saying that a collaborative marriage needs to look like that per se, but there was nobody had more authority in the decision making than the other, right? And so, so we had very limited power. This guy, he got to decide who said the prayer, but but nonetheless, I guess that was being the leader. So that is, you know, she. Right, so and they also enjoyed a very good sexual relationship because she saw her desires as important as did he. So these women with higher agency, they accepted themselves. They felt worthy of care and of pleasure and of honoring their desires. And they also tolerated the process of making choices within competing values, within complexity. They honored their desires, they accepted their sexuality, and they believed their ability to discern and sort out what was right for them. They believed in that they could do it. They trusted God, and they saw themselves as choosers in relationship with God. So, so why such a distinction between these groups? Why were some LDS women who were growing up hearing the same messages much more constrained by them, much more external in their referencing, and why were some women much more self-authoring, much more agentic? And then how can we perhaps facilitate within ourselves, within the people we love, more ability to be agents, self-authors within an embedded, you know, experience of growing up in the church. So unfortunately, my research did not look at the question of why. Okay, it was just, you know, how are women in relationship to these ideas? So I wasn't looking at why there were these differences. But of note, I think, is that these higher agency women had experienced plenty of adversity. Okay, it wasn't that they'd just grown up in sex-positive families who had parents who honored their desires. In fact, that really wasn't their story at all. I mean, some of them had grown up in pretty difficult situations, actually. In fact, the woman that was pursuing a medical degree had come from a home where her parents had divorced, and her mother, she lived with her mother, and then her mother had had multiple boyfriends all through her adolescence. And there was a lot of instability in her early experience. She did not want what her parents had, right? She wanted and her parents stopped going to church. She wanted what her young women's leaders had, okay? So she wanted the law of chastity. She wanted to wait until marriage, because I think for her, it was like, that is how I'm going to find what I want in life, a committed relationship, a relationship to sexuality that's not so chaotic and disruptive, because I think there had been an affair in there and something in her parents' marriage. And so, you know, while she was learning at church the value of the law of chastity, it wasn't like, oh, you must do this or no one's going to love you. She was relating to it as, this is something to give me what I want, because I want stability. I want commitment from a future partner. This is something I value. So it looked like compliance on the one hand, but it was actually a function of self-determination, right? So to the naked eye, it just looks like obedience. But actually, this was her choosing a kind of constraint on her life that she thought would give her the life she wanted. And also, it was happening in the face of invalidation, not getting what you want, which I'm going to talk about, because this is often where we forge more agency and moral capacity, is actually in friction. It's actually when we're not being given what we want in life. So while my dissertation research didn't answer this question, I have spent my career attempting to answer it, right? What facilitates our development? How do I, as a counselor or teacher, help people grow in their relational and sexual and moral capacity? So much of the work I do is developmental. It's not dealing with pathology. I mean, I'm a licensed therapist, but I'm not helping people with mental illness. I'm helping people grow in their capacity to love and to be intimate in their lives, which is developmental, because as much as we're in an external reference of self, our sense of self is highly dependent upon validation and approval. And to the degree that we need validation and approval, there is an inverse relationship to that need for approval and our willingness to be known, our willingness to really let someone in on who we are. So in my book, That We Might Have Joy, okay, available for purchase later if you want, I outline 3 stages of ego development, or in other words, the stages of moral and relational development. And there's a lot of developmental theorists. There's some that have 11 stages, some that have 9, 2. And so I drew pretty heavily on Robert Kegan's work. He has 5 stages of development, but I put it into 3 just to help people kind of be able to simplify or think about what is at stake if we're growing. What are we doing as we're growing in our ability to have more intimate relationships? This is highly related to spiritual development, relational development, moral development. They all go together, and sexual development. So, okay, so how we relate to ourselves and others, that is really the question, because we start out in, as I'm going to talk about, so we start out in this external sense of self, highly dependent on others to tell us who we are. And as we grow, we progressively grow into a deeper and deeper internal sense of self. We move from dependency on others to tell us who we are and what is right, to a deeper internal sense of who we are and what is right. So, and there's no other way. Okay, we must start in stage 1. A baby has no ability to make sense of themselves except for what the people around them are telling them about who they are. Right? We are looking to our caregivers to tell us if we matter. Do we have inherent value? Right? Are we worthy of care? Are we worthy of attention? And a very lucky baby, okay, when you really are loved, you have that divine mirror reflected back to you, that you're precious because you exist. You fill your parents with joy just because you exist, not because of anything you're doing. And that's a kind of core question. You start looking to that. Okay, now if you are in an abusive situation, right, you often get a false picture reflected back. And it can feel very true because you are inherently dependent in that stage. And so that dependency is a part of the human experience. And families, systems can either facilitate your liberation from that dependency, or they can hijack that dependency and take advantage of that dependency. Okay, the lesson, when we're not good parents and teachers, we're exploiting that need of a child for our validation. We use it for our own needs. So So let me give you just an overview of what these stages are and how we grow through them. So first, I'll talk about stage 1. First of all, before you're like, I'm so stage 3, like, just know that all of us probably spend time in every stage. Even if you've arrived at stage 3, somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're going to be pretty stage 1. Okay, so that is to say, it's not like you just graduate and you never return. Okay, so when we're under pressure, we tend to regress in our moral thinking and our ability to think clearly. But stage 1 is motivated primarily by safety. It's it's egocentric. Okay, so when we're in this early stage, we're learning how to self-inhibit and to control our impulses. And often that how we're learning it is because we are looking to authority figures to help us do that. We want their acceptance and we don't want to not get in trouble. So we want the rewards of complying and we want to avoid the punishment or the invalidation of not complying. And so your view of the world is pretty black and white, right? And for example, you choose not to lie. If you choose not to lie in that stage, you're doing it because you don't want to get in trouble, right? It's not because you're thinking about your impact on others per se. You can care about others, but you care about them kind of because you need them, because they help you feel safe in the world. And so it's a very egocentric state. Your morality is really filtered through your need for safety and for gratification. If you're in a neurotypical mind and you're in a secure home, you very likely would start to move into the second stage, which is the social stage, around age 8. That's when you start to become more able to think about the group. What does this group expect of me? How do I belong? That's your primary motivation. You go from a motivation of safety to a motivation of belonging. I want to fit in here. I want to matter to this group. And what are the rules of engagement to belonging in this group? Right? So I remember shortly after I got baptized, I wanted to bear my testimony. Okay. That is what I think I was doing, is I knew that this was a way of being in the group. This is a way of belonging. So it wasn't so much a deep and profound expression of knowing anything. It was a way of saying, I want to do what the group does because I want to belong to this group. And so we are very much internalizing the way that the people that matter to us think. Now, again, this is developmentally appropriate. We are borrowing their frames of reference. We're borrowing the moral systems. And we need convention. We need institutions. We need laws. We need rules. And we're absorbing all of those and learning how to engage with them. Our sense of self is still very external at this stage, right? But not as profoundly as it was in stage 1. In other words, you are more, so, I'll tell a story. When I was like maybe 3 or 4 years old, I'd learned how to write my name. And I went on the wall behind the couch in our living room and I wrote Jennifer on the wall, okay, backwards J and everything. And then my brother saw it and he's like, Jennifer, did you write on the wall? And so I'm like, I remember standing there trying to figure out how to answer. And he's like, remember, if you tell the truth, you won't get in trouble. And so I'm like, trying to decide. And I was like, no, Carl did it. And he's like crawling around on the floor there. Okay. Very precocious, Carl. Yeah. So, okay. My moral sense in that is just, how do I avoid anything adverse happening to me? Okay. So I'm going to just do what I think will protect me. In stage 2, you might still do that, okay, in stage 2, but you're thinking more. I'm not thinking in stage 1 about how that might impact my relationship to my brother or how that might impact my little brother that I just framed. Okay, I'm not thinking about other people. I'm really thinking about me. In stage 2, you start to think more about, okay, I care about doing something that will hurt your feelings. I care about not only having you like me and be happy with me, I also do care how I affect you. Okay, so you do start recognizing the people are different than you and they need and want different things, but your sense of self is still largely walking around on other people. And so it's kind of, I need you to feel okay about me for me to feel okay about me. Now, of course, in the church, we have standards and ways of behaving that prove we dress modestly, we don't smoke. We know what shows that we're a good Latter-day Saint. But this is not just a Latter-day Saint phenomenon, okay? Because I remember training to be a therapist, and all therapists in training were wearing linen clothes and big beads, and I'm like, I don't like linen clothes and big beads. Like, how am I gonna be a good therapist if I don't look like one? You know. So that is to say, you see like people very quickly start doing what their group does as a way to demonstrate that they have merit within that group. And so we feel often in this stage like we're thinking independently, but actually we're thinking like our group thinks, right? You know, how many of us, well, maybe that's not true for you all, but you know, many people just have the same political views as their parents have, as their community has, that the favorite channel they listen to has. That we are very, very seduced into thinking like the people around us because belonging is so important to us, right? It's really easy to be critical from somebody outside our group, but how often do we stand up for someone outside our group to someone inside our group? That's a much harder thing to do. And that's really a measure of deeper internal authority. Okay. So again, it's still, our capacity for intimacy is higher in this stage, but it's still really constrained by, I need you to be okay with me for me to be okay. So most people get married at stage 2, in the stage 2 phase of life. And we really gravitate to being needed, to roles. Okay, so the church is very good at helping people get into stage 2 because it's teaching you about roles and cooperation and doing unto others as you'd want them to do to you, and you have a job and you have a job and you need each other and you take care of each other's needs. That's all stage 2 talk. Okay, and we take a lot of security in it because if you need me, you're not going to leave me, right? If you need me. And a lot of people, you know, need, and they marry people who need to be needed. But those are 2 needy positions, and they're both dependent on, I can earn a self through you needing me, or earn a self by being a provider of care to you. Okay, so a lot of women in the research that there were the lower agency group, they were very much in this stage, looking outwardly to know who to be, and this idea of kind of denying your desires and your self-reference makes you have value, right? Right, don't be selfish. A lot of women that come to my Art of Desire retreats are kind of like, you can be selfish or selfless, okay? Like seeing it in a very binary way, and like you kind of can either, you know, some women say to me, I'm just so afraid if I start to think about my sexual desires, next thing you know, I'll be like a selfish prostitute. So I was like, that's better than a selfless prostitute. I mean, I know you could be, but or, you know, I'm going to be on a stripper pole if I let myself start thinking about these things. So we have a lot of fear that that there's no way to kind of integrate and be agents within it. Okay. Okay. So the biggest transition in moral development is from stage 2 to stage 3. Mary Beth Raines, who is an LDS therapist, she wrote a piece in Sunstone, like in 2001, I think, about sexual development. And she talks about this, I think she put it in 6 stages, but she talks about this transition from external authority to internal authority as a continental divide in human development. And most people don't make it across, okay? Because it's so compelling to try and stay in that validation pursuit and the security of, if I just fit in, okay, then I will not be left alone on the tundra. Okay, I will have my group, and I don't want to think for myself, and I don't want to take responsibility for my choices. And so that's a challenging transition that we tend to avoid because there's a lot of exposure in moving into stage 3. But before I talk about stage 3, let me just kind of make a more of a, this is, you're moving from the letter of the law of stages 1 and 2 into the spirit of the law in stage 3. And so when you start to move to stage 3, you are using what you internalized from stages 1 and 2, the self-inhibition of stage 1, the social rules and expectations of stage 2. Right? You use the letter of the law in those stages to create an internal compass, to start building one. And so then in stage 3, you are asserting a self into the complexity of living in a fallen world. You start recognizing, I have to be a chooser. I have to determine who I'm going to be, because what you often find is that life doesn't just give you choices where the answer is clear. And so the reason why a lot of us don't move into stage 3 is because it asks us to sacrifice the pursuit of validation. It asks us to give up the fantasy of certainty and to take the risk of self-authoring, of engaging our agency and asserting a self into the world, taking responsibility for its impact. And we don't like it because it's exposing, and it asks for a certain amount of aloneness from us to forge who we're going to be in the world. Stage 3, I'm going to talk about how we come through it, but it's defined by the ability to choose among competing values and competing outcomes, to determine where we are going to stand and who we're going to be, even though there are losses on both sides. So it asks us to tolerate the lack of certainty and of safety to pursue what we believe is good. Okay, so I'm going to say more about that in a minute, but I'm just tempted to ask, anybody have any quick questions? I just want to make sure nobody's lost yet in what I'm saying. Are you okay? Okay. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sure. Yeah, they don't. I would say some of us might arrive there in some domains of our life. Like I know clients that have self-determined in their careers and so on, but they are very slow to kind of really choose into their intimate relationships, to really bring their full selves there. So we may do it in some domains of our life, but in others hedge and hold back. And, I was talking to my son today as I was driving here, and he was saying, I really, it's hard for me to really pursue somebody that I like, to really like. He's like, I'm willing to do it, but I just want to know that they like me first. Okay. So I'm like, okay. Don't we all want that? Okay. Like, but I was saying, like, to really be happy in a relationship, you got to bring your full self there and take the risk, right? I don't mean if somebody's giving you a full no, you let the possibility go, of course. But when I was dating my husband, he's older than me, and he was very clear that he wanted the relationship. I wanted to be wanted by him, but I didn't want to step in myself. I wanted the validation of being pursued, but I didn't necessarily want to invest my full self there. And so, when I finally got into enough crisis with myself that I needed to choose one way or the other, I did decide to fully step in, which terrified me. I could get into that in another whole class, but when I fully stepped in, and so I was saying this to my son today, when I fully stepped in, it actually liberated Dad to be able to think about, wait, you're accepting my offer? Like, okay, give me a minute. I'm not sure if I want this, And now that I'm actually here, there's more room to think about the things that I don't bring to the table. And so I said, you're never going to have a relationship that's fully secure. There's always risk in loving someone. But if you hedge, you will inevitably suffer. And so when you really have a relationship that's alive, it asks us to invest, to bring our full selves to our lives, which requires exposure and risk, but it's the only way we can actually experience a full engagement in life and to develop capacity to really love and be loved. But it does ask of a kind of faith, a kind of risk, a tolerance that growth demands of us. So how do we progress through these stages? And in particular, how do we progress from an external sense of morality to a deeper internal sense? To a deeper expression of agency, because as you progress, your agency actually expands, right? You become more able to make choices because you aren't as held down by your pursuit of safety or belonging. So as many developmental theorists articulate, we develop as reality or truth challenges our understanding of ourselves and reality. That's how growth happens. And this happens in relationship to the world and in relationship to one another. We evolve when our current understanding is inadequate, when we need a new way of making sense of our lives. Clients reach out to me when they're stuck, when their current way of seeing the world, themselves, or their relationship is no longer working. And so they're looking for a better way. They're looking for more wisdom. And this is often when people are the most receptive to change, most receptive to a new understanding, is when their old frame is breaking and they know it. Now, my clients could best be defined as self-deceived, okay, but couldn't we all be? That is, living in a blind spot that's keeping them stuck and limiting their agency. And so as a therapist, my goal is to help people wake up to themselves and their lives so that they can choose better, choose with more clarity, choose more in line with their higher selves, with their moral selves. And, as Einstein purportedly said, you can't solve a problem at the level of intelligence in which the problem was created. You have to increase your intelligence to solve it. That's what moral development is. We come into impasses, and we have to expand our intelligence, our understanding of what's going on and how we're participating in the problem if we're going to create something better. And so how we get stuck is in our pursuit of validation or in our pursuit of sense of safety. We tend to tell ourselves stories that keep ourselves and our worldview justified, but keep us stuck and limit our agency because we can't actually choose better. Right? In a sense, like the Mormon women who are going to defend ERA, they're trying to defend something. Right? And so they're willing to not ask questions or to just fold in because they're trying to hold on to something, a sense of belonging, a sense of mattering, a sense of a God that's backing up what they do, a sense of fear of the outside world, right? And so they are actors and they're acting within a certain frame. The question is, if they could see their situation more clearly from a broader view, right? If they could see that I may not lose these things, would they still choose the same way, right? And so basically, I'm often think of my role is helping people to see themselves and their relationship more truthfully, because in seeing that, even though it hurts often, they're more able to choose in a way that is stronger, better for them, better for the relationship. So moral and relational development happens when we integrate more truth, more reality into our mind. Robert Keegan talked about evolution of our morality as not about putting more things into the mind, but the vessel of the mind changing, growing, and therefore starting to see things differently. And so this is what developmental psychologists label as moving from an ego-syntonic state, all is well, I love you, you love me, whatever, the church is perfectly true, okay, into an ego dystonic state, which is you realize that the realities I'm coming up against, I can't fit into the container that I have. I have a container and there is data that does not fit into that container. Okay. And this is really, really hard. All of us hate this. We all say we love the truth, but in reality, we all hate the truth. We don't like this moment. Okay. I remember it was like 2020. I was very anxious about the upcoming election, and I was talking to my husband about something, and he thinks quite similarly to me around politics, but he was just defending the view of the other side, and I was losing my mind. Okay, like okay, I literally was kind of like, and I mean, and he wasn't even justifying it. He's just trying to explain it, And for me, because I think I had a lot of fear at that point, as so much of our country has had from different perspectives, it just makes the integration of another view feel like you're going to lose something, right? And so your ability to think clearly and wisely and to hold complexity goes down, okay? By the end of the bike ride, I'm like, you might be right. But I'm actually really grateful for that, to be honest. I'm never grateful in the moment, but I'm always grateful when my husband is pushing me on a view that is too limited, because it just, ultimately I come out of that more integrated, holding more wisdom, holding more clarity, at least holding more complexity, because our minds prefer much more simple and self-justified views. Just to give us an example, if I had a video, I'd show it, but like there's, so Robert Keegan based a lot of his developmental work on Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. And there was some research done on kids in the pre-operational stage. It's just a way of logic, and operational is logical and so on, and pre-operational is more living in fantasy and so on. Kids up to about age 5 are in the pre-operational stage, and then kids start to transition to the operational stage around age 6, and by age 7, most kids are squarely in the operational stage. So what they were doing was giving an operational level question to 7-year-olds who were just nailing it, confidently answering. Then they'd give the operational question to the pre-operational kids, and they would also nail it wrongly, but they were like, got that, like I'm so good at this, okay? And they were very confident in their wrong answers. The 6-year-olds would answer it from a pre-operational mind, but then you could see that they knew it was wrong, but they didn't know what was actually right. And you could see the distress in their faces. They would give the wrong answer, and then you'd see them like they knew something was wrong with it, but they hadn't yet evolved into a mind that could hold the truer view. And that right there is a lot of my clients, okay? That you're in that, your old view is falling apart, but you don't yet have a new way of knowing. And it's hard, it's distressing, and we tend to resist it. And so, in marriage therapy, some people are leaving sessions with the question, maybe I've been a lot more self-serving and self-justified than I thought, right? Or maybe I'm putting up with mistreatment and I've been being complicit in it. Or maybe following church policy is not as secure as I have thought. And these moments are stressful. We like our maps of reality. We rely on them. They organize us, our sense of who we are and the world. And they give us a sense of control. And the ego, the natural man in us, loves control, or the perception of it anyway. And so these moments of expansion or potential expansion, when we realize we have data that doesn't fit into our self-perception or our view of the world, we're up against a pivotal choice. Okay? In our discomfort, we can deny reality. We can self-deceive. Okay? It's not that I'm doing things that are self-serving in my marriage, it's that you're so sensitive. Okay? We can deny the data that's in front of us. We can do this by only talking to people that agree with us, side with our limited perspective. We can make caricatures of the people who think differently than we do. We can only listen to the channels or that reinforce our worldview, or listen to the friends that reinforce our worldview. So we're good at basically rejecting data that we don't want to accommodate. And that will always keep us in a lower stage of development. Or we can tolerate the disorientation and the disorganization of change and trust in that process of accommodating more truth. Trusting in truth, in goodness, in God, enough to tolerate that transformation and that reworking of our souls. And on some level, this is definitely an expression of faith, right? How much do we value what is true over what we wish were true? How much will we prioritize what love asks of us over what we feel like giving or what feels safe to us? And so because this is so uncomfortable in moments, we often resist it, but very much at our own expense. I know I certainly do, right? Don't tell me what I don't want to know about you. Don't tell me things about myself that I don't want to know about me, okay? Right? This is so often why marriages fail, is an unwillingness to know one another as you actually are, to really know each other without trying to alter or change or deny who the other one is. And so a lot of times we don't want to grow and evolve, even though that is what love and our spirituality asks of us. St. Bradley of Nyssa said, sin is the refusal to keep growing. And I think that captures it very well, which is it's not about making mistakes. I mean, we're in a fallen world and we are imperfect beings in development. Mistakes will be made, okay? We're going to be making mistakes, even if we're borrowing wisdom from others. But as we bump up against reality and we confront our limitations and we confront our blind spots, sin is not learning from those, not continuing to strive and to grow, and instead to cling to the world as we know it and the artificial sense of control. That's sin, in my opinion. So growth in our capacity. Have I already been talking an hour? Oh, is that true? Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Okay, that's so fast. Okay, so growth in our capacity comes with friction and strain. To build muscle, we must subject ourselves to friction. You go to exercise, you're picking up weights, you're choosing the discomfort of straining yourself, okay? This is also true in our personal development. To build personal capacity, we must choose into the anxiety of being outside of our current capacity. And when we choose into it, it's where we can grow in our understanding, grow in our wisdom, grow in our capacity. When I'm working with clients, you can see real differences in people, because sometimes you tell people hard things about themselves and they will fight you all the way down. They just will not take it, even though their denial is hurting them. It's costing them their marriage. It's costing their kids. It's costing them their own peace with themselves. And then you have clients who will take hard things and they will struggle with it, and they will push themselves to be truthful to themselves, to their conscience. And they change. They go and sin no more. They do differently. They go into the next moment with their spouse or their child or their whatever situation they're in, and they choose better. They don't indulge the lesser part of them. And this is often not related very much to how good they had it as a child, right? I've seen people come out of really hard situations with tremendous courage in their lives. And people who've been given pretty good situations who just insist that they stay the center of the world. And so this willingness to do what's hard but also right allows us to keep growing and tolerate the humiliation, in a sense, the humbling reality of learning a better way. So while the institutional church tends to overemphasize obedience, our actual theology teaches us how fundamental our agency is to our spiritual growth. And I think we need the black and white. We need the structures that we start in, right? We need to learn to control ourselves, to learn how to live by the rules so that we can break them wisely in Dalai Lama's framing. Because we'll inevitably come up against experience in which the rules fail, where there's no easy answer. I want a baby, but I also want to develop a gift that I feel I've been given. I want to follow church leaders, but what is being taught goes against what I feel is right. I want to be married and have a secure family, and yet I'm in a marriage in which I feel I'm losing myself. I'm disappearing in it, right? And so these are experiences that push us out of stage 2 into that social embedded validation pursuit toward the sovereignty of stage 3. These collisions in our values and our desires, right, they hurt. Is there no other way? That question comes into my mind often, and clients' minds, when reality is asking for something more from you than you know that you have the capacity to give. Because these collisions in our values ask us to determine, who will I be? Right? What do I believe is most right? What loss am I willing to endure? Which I think we don't like to think that moral development asks loss of us, but it always does. Right? I think the Adam and Eve story very much captures that foundational reality of moral development. In a fallen world, we will confront dilemmas that ask us to determine who we'll be. What loss and uncertainty will I endure? What will I sacrifice or give up to create something that I think is better? Right? And Eve understood this best. Okay. And perhaps because as women in a patriarchal church, we're up against this friction so often, right? Embedded in a social experience that we value, that we see a great good in, and yet pushed up against questions of ourself within it. Mormon women's experience is so often the experience of competing goods, competing desires, and no easy answers. I was just listening to Mormon Land podcast interviewing Robin Rich on her book, Using Friction to Grow. And she was interviewing LDS women who started careers during the 70s and 80s when they were being counseled to go home, to not work, and kind of what was happening inside of them that they made those choices. And she talked about friction as so fundamental to that forging of self. She was using a little bit different language than that, but how I see it is that you're up against these competing things. I love a church. I want to follow what the prophet says, and I also want very much to develop this part of myself. I want a family. I also want a career. I love the church, but I also feel trivialized in it. I value the church's position on marriage and fidelity, but I hate the church's tolerance of polygamy or of the imbalance of men's and women's voices in the institutional church. And so these contradictions push us out of validation pursuit. Now, we don't have to do it, okay, because we can curse God and die, okay, or we can realize the world's not going to give me what I want. The strange thing about our development is so often we build capacity when we're not getting what we want. There is a lot to be said about validation and support, but we really overvalue it in our society at present. It's often in our suffering that we forge something deeper within ourselves. I when I was a young person, I wanted very much, I loved my church experience. I loved my family. I wanted very, very much to belong. And at a young age, I learned about polygamy, which was really challenging for my young sense of self, because I felt this experience of God loving me. And yet the whole framing of polygamy felt like I, as a woman, was not as important as a man. And if this was God's institution, that was what was the message in it. And so I started holding these two realities always inside my heart, like that I was learning deep truths that mattered to me. There was a God that loved me, that what I do matters, that there's a deep and fundamental morality to our lives. And yet I had a cousin who was gay, who was talking to me because he didn't, an LDS cousin, who didn't know how to handle the fact of his sexuality while being in a church that had no place for it, right? And so these complexities were breaking my heart, okay? And because I didn't know how to resolve them. I didn't know how to be true and belong to a group that I wanted to belong to and be true to my conscience. And I look back on that with actually a lot of gratitude at this stage in my life, because it was actually not being embedded in this idea that of a moral world that I live in, and yet that it wasn't, I wasn't on a glide path into happiness, that there was friction, that there were competing goods, because that pushed me to find something deeper in myself and to start forging a self in the world, to start answering the question of how can I be true to this faith I love, to this community I love, and still be true to me, right? And that is a very individual process, but a very important process, because I really think it's in that sense and in that way that we take our gifts, divine gifts, and filter them through our agency to offer something to a fallen world. It's all imperfect, it always will be, but that's a very valuable process. And so while we can always do things to refine our institutions, to make them better, to teach truer ideas, to appeal to the best in our theology, and that's a very important project in and of itself, we will never, ever have perfect institutions. They will always be limited by the fact that lots of stage 1 and stage 2 people are running them, okay? And that's just kind of the truth of it, okay? And so you're gonna fall into, I mean, and this is true for many ideologies, not just LDS ideology, okay? Because a lot of people go and they leave LDS, structures, and they jump into another one, and then they still are in a black and white world. I like some client who'd gone through a faith crisis, and he's being all dogmatic and rigid to his wife, who is still a believer, all judgmental. I'm like, I thought you were trying to leave dogma, okay? Like now you're just doing another version of it. So so we should be compassionate to one another, because we're all capable of this. And it compels our egos, okay? But so while we can work on improving our institutions, they will always be limited by what they are. And really, to grow in our spirituality and towards a deeper moral capacity, it is always more alone than we want it to be. It always asks for more exposure from us than we may want. This "is there no other way" question is often that question, because it asks us to be an actor and to affect the world around us without certainty and guarantee, and to learn how to love in the face of suffering and loss and uncertainty. So that friction, as hard as it is, can also be embraced to offer your gifts more wholeheartedly into the world. And so that's my presentation for you. Thank you. So do we have a few minutes for questions? Yeah. So any questions or thoughts? Yes, in the back, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Change or shine more, be you in the world. read this book, Series. I really.
Oh, yeah.
What is your perspective if you?
Ooh, what did you tell yourself or help yourself when it came to when you were a teenager and you learned about the polygamy, and you were also dealing with a cousin who was trusting you and saw something in you to lean on you?
Yeah.
What did you tell yourself to be able to, knowing that like maybe the gospel stays the same, but how you can shine and still find your own like agency way? Like, what did you?
Yeah, so I think my initial way of approaching it was something's wrong with me. Something must be wrong with me, because there's people much more intelligent than me who get it, who don't have these issues. And so at first I thought, I'm broken in some way. I don't have enough faith. I don't have enough trust. For me, I was like, okay, I have to give my whole self to it. This is just my path, okay? And so I decided to go on a mission, and I was just like, God, I'm going to give my whole self. And all I ask for is testimony. That's all I need, okay? I just need to know, like, give me what everybody else seems to have. So, and I think what I was also doing was pushing myself, like I was going to test the limits of what I was being offered, to make sure I'd given it everything I had. And so when I went into the MTC, everybody's up there, I know this, I know that, I know everything. And I'm like, okay. Like, and I remember being in a testimony meeting, my companion was like, you know, she was the best for me in the MTC, because she's just much more like, oh, you know, I don't know, it's not a big deal. Like, she just was way more like, and in a good way. And she's like, I'm there in testimony meeting, like, yeah. She's like, I don't know if I can do this. And so I remember like praying in that testimony meeting, like, God, is this what you're asking of me? Are you just asking me to lie? Am I supposed to just self-deceive? Is that the path into righteousness? And I just had the clear sense in that moment, no. Right? Anything true can withstand your honesty. Okay, I had to learn this lesson a few times actually, but I like in that moment, I was like, no, I can be self-honest. Okay, I got to get to the real question here. So basically, my mission was very much the experience for me by the end of believing that God wanted me to be honest and to let go of what I felt was wrong and to cling to and live by what I thought was right. And that was a process that was important for me. And so once I sort of had this divine kind of recognition, something shifted in me. It doesn't mean I didn't still want validation. I didn't even want that to be true. I just wanted the church to be true in this simple way. And because I was afraid of losing the respect of people whose respect I wanted. But I had a deeper trust of self-honesty and earnestness, a purity of heart. And that doesn't mean I'm always pure in heart, but the desire to know what's true is its own good, even though I would do that imperfectly. So I think once I learned to trust that more, it freed me up to start listening to my own heart a little more deeply. Yeah. Yes.
I actually thought of this question when we read something of yours for Carolyn's gendering Mormonism class. And you write a lot about like sort of low desire women. And I wonder if that shifted at all with sort of asexuality and demisexuality.
Has what shifted?
Has your views or understanding evolved? Or is that included in the idea of like low desire women? Or men?
I'm not sure if I know the question and I don't know if I quite follow it. So has it changed? So what I would say is there is a spectrum of people's natural interest in sex that is more biological. And then there's the tolerance of intimacy, which is more developmental. And so there are going to be people with high sexual interest and low tolerance for intimacy, and people with low sexual interest but high tolerance of knowing and being known, right? So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah. So a lot of low desire women, well, a lot of women's sexual map and way of moving into arousal is very different than men's, okay? Just generally as a group, generally speaking. When women feel like they should feel desire, okay, because I'm trying to prove or be something for my spouse, that's when desire definitely goes down. Okay, so there's often psychological pressures that are putting an artificial brake on one's actual sexual interest that I'm interested in people seeing, so they know what is actually being true to themselves. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Sure.
I had a question going back to some of your dissertation research. You mentioned categorizing very broadly some women into sort of higher agency and lower agency.
Yeah.
Is that something that sort of came from the interviewees? Like, did they
Yes.
describe themselves in that way? Oh, can you elaborate on
Did they
that?
describe themselves as having
Yes.
agency?
Yeah, did they describe themselves? And if not, how did they perceive their own agency? And how did you sort of arrive at this
Yeah.
framework?
So it was the question framing so meaning I was looking at literature on the question of sexual agency. I think it's a good question. I think I was asking them about how were they in relationship to their desires, and how did those play themselves out in their lives and in their relationships. So I don't know that I had like a really systematic model, but it was more this qualitative research of looking at where would they self-deny, where would they hold on to their desires, would they make decisions for validation more than from something inside of themselves that was being true to their desires. So, you could have two people that were doing the same behavior, but they were being driven by different motivations. And so that was part of how I put that together. I'd have to go back and read. It's been a while. It's been like 26 years now, but I think I'm trying to think if there'd be other things I'd answer about that. Yeah, just how much self-doubt, how much were they deferring their judgment outside of themselves and in turmoil versus maybe acknowledging differences, but being truer to themselves. And it wasn't in a kind of defiant way. It was more like, I recognize some people think this and this, but I feel this, right? So it was more individuation. Yes.
The teaching of sexuality didn't help you space change in the last 26 years, because you talked about that there was nothing out there, and it has changed. Well,
There's way more, sex therapists and books and things than there certainly was back then.
And in
institutional level, I mean, I think it has evolved. Now, like For the Strength of Youth manual was still, like in 2011, it was still not a great one, Then I think in 2019, when did they know? No, it was sooner than that, more recent than that. The most recent For the Strength of Youth manual is much more agency-based, much more about making decisions, being a chooser in this reality, not so dictating, not fear-driven. So I can't remember if that was like in 2021, 22, somewhere they released a new one, and it seemed to have a lot of these ideas in it, to not use fear in thinking about sexuality and how to help youth navigate their sexual nature. So I think that's a big improvement. And I know that when I used to talk in relief societies and things, letters were written to the bishop. I had some real challenging things right in the beginning there, but it's way different now. I mean, not that I don't go to relief studies anymore, because it's too complex. I'm like, if you want me to come talk, you get somebody's house and I'll come talk, but I don't want to do it in church anymore. But I think that meaning just because it gets people upset sometimes. But I would just say in general, the group that I'm talking to seems much more comfortable with these ideas. And I don't know if that's just because they're listening to my podcast and that's why they're sitting in front of me. And so they've already been shaped by that, or if the church as a whole is shifting. But my sense is I think the church as a whole is shifting. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that the church is really good at helping us get to stage 2.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you could give us some examples of
Sure.
the church has either progressed or digressed in helping us to get to stage 3. I know stage 3 is more complex and difficult, but over the last 30 or 40 years, because there's been a lot of changes in the church, and I'm just curious how that relates to stage 3. If they're better at it or worse at it, and in what ways?
I don't know. I don't know that I could tell you if they're worse or better at it, because I haven't really done any kind of historical analysis. A historian could probably tell you that better than I could. I think I'm not holding my breath for it to be good at helping us get to stage 3, because in a way, institutions work to reinforce themselves, not to help you transcend them. And so I'm not saying that we couldn't get better at it and kind of hold on to what Christ was saying, which is to transcend the need for validation, for being seen as good, in the minds of others. But this is just my perception, just as I think there's some leaders who understand that intuitively better than others. And so you hear some stage 1 talks, you hear some stage 2 talks, and you hear some stage 3 talks. And, Elder Uchtdorf is good at the stage 3 conversation. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. I won't do that. Yeah.
That you trust your own intentionality. And I'm wondering, when we talk about agency and making decisions, how you can trust your own, not you generally, how we can trust our own intentionality when we know that sometimes we don't deep down with how, like maybe we are being more selfish.
And we shouldn't trust it then. So I don't know that I don't know if I said I hope I didn't say I always trust my intentions, because I shouldn't. Yeah. In some situation or something what your desires are matter. But yes, I don't know that we should just be glibly trusting our intentions, because, I a lot of times have clients say to me, well, I didn't intend to hurt her feelings. I didn't intend to sound rude, some ways it doesn't really matter what you intended, because we're seldom telling ourselves, I want to be mean right now. We usually have a way of justifying our behavior, even if it's antisocial behavior, that is, it's hurtful or harmful. And so a lot of times what reveals our intentions best is our behavior. It's not a perfect revelation of our intention, but it's a better revelation of our intention than what we say about our behavior. And so if you want it, like you may say, I really want to exercise and get in shape. Well, you could say that. I have a friend who says it all the time while she is cutting a brownie and handing me one. So it's one that's true. I'm sure that many of us want that, but do we want it enough to do what it would require of us? That's really the measure. And so I would never say we should just trust our intentions, but I think when we have pushed ourselves on what it is we're really aiming for and our behavior backs it up, that in some ways we